Music, dance, paint, and language. What exactly are they expressing, and how do these interactions give you a new perspective on music itself? Let's take for an example this video excerpt played by a famous contemporary violinist called Patrycja Kopaczynskaja, where she plays a piece called Krin. How is this considered music? How can it be understood? To many of you, it may just sound absurd, even elitist, or not even like music. How can you understand music like a pro? That's exactly what gets addressed in this video. Two major distinctions in music. First major point in understanding music is the relationship between language and emotion. You have these two distinctions very clearly in the Western classical music tradition and evolution from speech-driven music to pure music. In the first part of the video, I will try to give you a deep dive into these two concepts, language and music, and their relation to each other. And then in the second part, I will show you the many ways of the differentiation of those two parts through the lens of speech-driven music and pure music. Now, I will try to explain the relationship of music and language with each three handpicked examples and definitions. You have on the one hand logogenic, collusion, and Apollinian, and for pure music and emotional-driven music you have pathogenic, collision, and Dionysian. Don't be afraid if you heard of them the first time. I will explain them really shortly and in detail. What you now just have to understand is that they are in opposing positions to each other. First on our list, logogenic. Logogenic comes from the Greek word logos, which means word-born or word-generated. In opposition, you have pathogenic, which means emotion-born, coming from pathos. Coming up with our next example, collision and collusion. In this article from the British conductor and expert for historical playing, which means an expert for the aesthetics of the 16th to 18th century Western music, Sir John Eliot Gardiner separates the concept as collision and collusion. Collusion as a metaphor for language-driven and logogenic and the rationale. Collision as a metaphor for the emotion-driven, pathogenic and irrational. The terms collision and collusion are admittedly a little bit confusing. One is collusion in a direct sense of sympathy and empathy between the import and the meaning of the words and the type of music that Bach uses to surround it and explain it, the text. And then there's at the other extreme collision, those moments where the music and the text seem to end up pointing in opposite directions. So Sir John Eliot Gardiner explains a slightly different approach where with collusion music and text go together in a symbiotic way, and collision where music and text point to opposite directions, which can be interpreted as irrational or pathogenic in this case. Another example with someone who popularized those two distinctions with concepts of Apollinian and Dionysian is none other than the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Apollinian being from the rational and Dionysian being from the ecstatic. Also derived from the Greeks, specifically Apollinian from Apollo, the god of the rationale and the high arts, and Dionysos, the god of the ecstatic and the wine. Especially the core concepts of the Dionysian subject, which is represented in the constant reaching to ecstasis and the Selbstüberwindung, as the merging of those two to get to the status of Übermensch, which can be heard in the distinctive Wagnerian harmony. Friedrich Nietzsche, who popularized the two concepts from Schelling, who first brought it up, was someone who had a great influence on music literature itself, for instance with his book Also sprach Zarathustra, that inspired Richard Strauss, also a German and a composer, to this piece as a symphonic poem that you probably actually know. Now for Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, the German composer Richard Wagner was the inspiring figure for his Dionysian concept, which he addressed in his book Die Geburt der Tragödie, which can be translated into The Birth of Tragedy. Aus dem Geiste der Musik was his first version, and the second one later didn't have this kind of title because he criticized Wagner in the same book with a different preface because of Richard Wagner's anti-Semitic views. Of course, that was very simplified, and I will try to address it in a justly manner in a separate video. So in summary, we have language-driven music and emotional music, Apollinian, Dionysian, collision and collusion, logogenic and pathogenic. Now, the big question remains, how do you actually differentiate those two? How to differentiate the two concepts?
Entschuldigung, da müsst ihr wie ein Dinosaurier in einen Riesenapfel hineinbeißen.
Nikolaus Anoncourt, a famous conductor for historical playing and expert for the linguistic side of music, analyzed in his book Musik als Klangrede, which can be translated as music as speech, had three musical categories from Giulio Caccini's Le Nuove Musiche: recita cantando, speaking through music; cantar recitando, singing through speaking; and cantare, pure music. For clarity purposes, I would give recita cantando the book emoji, the cantar recitando a heart and a book emoji, and cantare the heart emoji. Recita cantando. Recita cantando features dominant speech patterns. Maybe you have something already in your mind? I was thinking of this guy.
Fuck a beat, I go a cappella. Fuck a Papa Doc, fuck a clock, fuck a trailer, fuck everybody. Fuck y'all if you doubt me. I'm a piece of fucking white trash, I say it proudly. And fuck this battle, I don't want to win, I'm outie. Here, tell these people something they don't know about me.
Or this passage from Verdi's Messa di Requiem. In these, you would have a primary focus on text delivery or speech patterns, light musical structure. Other examples are early Italian opera recitatives, or modern parallels like rhythmic focused rap, Kendrick Lamar, Eminem, Public Enemy, you call them. And everything that's basically non-tonal and uses language as speech rhythms. Bridging the gap to our next subdivision, where speech-like qualities transform to melodic speech, can be found in exquisite and very eloquently modern-day examples, like in the Belgian techno anthem Pump Up the Jam.
Pump up the jam, pump it up while your feet are stumping, and the jam is a place to stay.
Cantar recitando. Cantar recitando combines melodic elements while preserving speech-like qualities. You could argue the best of both worlds. Modern examples can be connected to the broad pop music very obviously, or like also Gardiner said, Bach with his accompanied recitatives.
Aber die hohen Priester und die Ältesten überredeten das Volk, dass sie Barabbas bitten sollten und Jesum brächten. Da antwortete nun der Landpfleger und sprach zu ihnen: Welchen wollt ihr unter diesen Zweien, den ich euch soll losgeben? Sie sprachen:
In general, you could say it still preserves speech-like qualities. You have also modern parallels like melodic rap from Drake or Post Malone. Linguistic parallels are ironically also Chinese operas because of the tonal language. Because Chinese language inherently provides a musical framework through its tonal intonation, seen in the following example.
妈妈骑马，马慢，妈妈骂马，妈妈骑马，马慢，妈妈骂马。Faster version. 妈妈骑马，马慢，妈妈骂马。
Let's bridge the gap between Cantar recitando and cantare with a quote from Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek from his book The Wagnerian Sublime, 4 Lacanian readings of classic opera. With Romanticism, music changes its role. It is no longer a mere accompaniment of the message delivered in speech. Which brings us to the final subdivision, cantare. You will get a good grasp what you can do without the addition of language when you look at the opera of Donizetti, Lucia di Lammermoor, with the aria Il dolce suono, which means sweet dreams, where the soprano Lucia is literally lost for words, singing without them in madness for a whole minute in a cadenza without accompaniment. Now that's also the category where the music video from early on in the intro may make more sense to you. The apparent words that Kopachinskaya speaks are not a real language, but they resemble them almost as if you can understand the language itself. You could get a sense of this maybe with this famous video, how English sounds to non-English speakers. I have to admit, I started like that as well.
It's fine for me to display the Joe drink all around the masturbatation town while I formass the Pope for cream and wonder why I chose Farine and all? Wonder why I bleed the whole chase between?
Now, Patricia Kopachinskaya accompanies her words and synchronizes it to the music played on an instrument to a full synthesis.
Which, interestingly, resembles also the phenomena of Broca and Wernicke aphasia, or people with dementia who have trouble speaking, and parallels to theories of language acquisition in a neurobiological sense.
Which will be addressed more intensely with very, very interesting connections to a music in a separate video. But the magic words, why pure music works so well in most cases is, maybe you guessed it, harmony, or rather tonal harmony. Contrary to the atonal piece from Cheong, the next example follows the same principle, except for one, which is tonality.
People, I think, always kura, ratama, all of that. I've chosen these Sanskrit words because of the quality of the vowels. Do it again, please. See how pure a choral sound you can get. Don't force it. So.
Kora mata, kora ratama, kora ratama. In this case, you have also words used that don't really make any sense, but in context, but rather because of the quality of the vowels and the phonetic qualities, they still make an impact regardless of the transfer of content-empty words. So you have pure music there. You can see parallels with it also in the K-pop scene, where group dance is added as an additional stimulus and embraced regardless of the obvious fact that for many people, not understanding the text initially, because many songs are obviously released in Korean, isn't actually a hindrance, but rather actually embraced by later combining and interpreting the text with the music and the dance choreography, which also seems to be the main focus and driving force of big K-pop fan groups like ARMY from BTS, for instance. They initially don't need to understand Korean to feel music, to feel the message. You could indeed interpret in retrospect that the middle ground becomes particularly interesting. It represents a balance between felt and rationale, collision and collusion, Apollinian and Dionysian, neither purely logogenic nor pathogenic, in negotiation between text and musical demands. Mahler's Second Symphony exemplifies Romanticism's approach when words alone cannot tell the whole story. Here music steps in to complete the narrative. Mit Flügeln, die ich mir errungen, werd ich entschweben. Sterben werd ich, zu leben. Auferstehen, ja auferstehen wirst du, mein Herz in einem Nu. Was du geschlagen, zu Gott, zu Gott, zu Gott wird es dich tragen. The narrative unfolds through wings attained by striving, the ascent mirrored in rising harmonics that draws towards the paradox of death and rebirth. The border between life and death vanishes as the celestial journey carries you to the divine, where pure music and language exist in a perfect, symbiotic relationship, each filling what the other lacks. What was once divided merges into a complete, transcendent experience that resonates through the infinite. Which gets us really to the key point. Interpretation closely relates to both the initial input and its ultimate impact, because the question remains, in the absence of language, what and when to interpret from the music input. Can music always be clearly divided into these binary concepts of language and emotion? Where do we have the evidence of consensus? This raises, of course, challenges and questions of retrospective manner, of hindsight bias and empirical limitations, because how could you possibly measure the subjective experience? In fact, during these times of hermeneutical frustration and dissociation, you find the security, ironically, in language itself, also in order to have a social and shared experience. So whether you're listening to Bach, BTS, Eminem, or Hans Zimmer, you call it, music is always a conversation. But the question here is, which side of the conversation speaks to you? I'm Nathan Pike, I'm a professional musician. Thanks for watching, until next time.